over the past 30, 40 years in the research around literature, all the research points to emotional intelligence as being the differentiator between good and great leaders. And emotional intelligence is, are you self-aware? Can you manage yourself? Are you socially aware? And can you navigate relationships skillfully? So, all this stuff does is provide you with self-awareness. And it's also interesting to me, one of the exercises we did in all of our leadership development courses was at the beginning kind of making the case for emotional intelligence and why this stuff is important in leadership. And we did this exercise where it was like worst boss, best boss. And you had the whole group talk about the worst boss, and then the whole group talked about the best boss. And, consistently the theme for best boss was never they're the smartest person in the room or they're a great strategic thinker. It was always about how they helped the person.
Hello, and welcome to episode 216 of the Quiet and Strong podcast, especially for introverts. I'm your host, David Hall, and the creator of quietandstrong.com. This is a weekly podcast dedicated to understanding the strengths and needs of introverts, along with strategies for success. Introversion is not something to fix, but to be embraced. Normally, we'll air each episode on a Monday. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite platform. Leave a review or a rating. That would mean a lot to me, and also help other people find the show. Tell a friend about the podcast and help get the word out there that introversion is a beautiful thing. Lindsey Bingaman is a coach and leadership development professional specializing in the integration of psychometric data, technology, and AI for leadership, team, and organizational development. All right. Well, welcome to the Quiet and Strong podcast, Lindsey. Lindsey, it's so great to have you on today.
Yeah, so great to be here, David. I love the concept of your podcast and have been listening to some of the episodes. So I'm so happy to be here today.
Awesome. And we're going to talk about your work with personality. I saw on LinkedIn you call yourself the personality explainer, and I'm just really excited to get into all that. First, just tell us a little bit about yourself, your journey to the work you're doing now.
Yeah, so, I've been fascinated with personality pretty much my entire life. When I look back on it, I remember my grandmother had these tapes by a woman named Florence Tower and literally audio cassettes that I would listen to about the four different, I think it must have been based on the disc model, the four different types of personalities. And then later in high school, I got obsessed with Myers-Briggs. It's literally like, oh my word, I have a manual for my body. Like, how did I never know this existed? And, went on for the next 4 years of college to like type every person who came across my path for more than 5 minutes. And then, from there was like, okay, how do I do this for a living? So that led me, step by step. And it was not like one of those fields where you're like, oh, I want to be a nurse, so I'm going to go to nursing school and then I'll get a job as a nurse. It was a field, that's kind of broken up and called different things in different places. So I kind of just found my way into figuring out how to use this for a living, which for me led me to a consulting firm. I was very fortunate to get connected early on to a dear mentor, Fran Johnston, and worked with her at Telios Leadership Institute for, pretty much the first 15 years of my career and the design and delivery of emotional intelligence-based leadership programs and as an executive coach that focused on emotional intelligence and now as a coach educator. So that's kind of been the foundation, the core of my career in using these types of concepts to help people build self-awareness. And now I work at a software company, a tech startup that uses personality data and integrates it with AI and technology to help people be more self-aware and have stronger relationships.
Awesome. And we are going to get into all of that. How would you describe your own personality?
Ooh, it's a great question. And it brings up for me like what's so hard about talking about this stuff because in some ways you can reduce it to a real simple kind of I'm this or I'm that, and in other ways you're like, well, where do I even begin? There's the complexities of there. But I would say like just superficially or just kind of to make it really succinct, I am like a double-fisted people person. When you look at my chart, and we'll talk about this, I'm sure, with Prism, the tool I use, it measures 54 traits and attributes. And a lot of my points are really about people. I want to talk, I want to listen, I want to understand them, I want to see people patterns. So I think warm, I'm cooperative, I want harmony, and I'm a people person, or kind of how I would describe myself in a nutshell.
Awesome. And of course, not everybody's like you. And that's what we're really going to get into is really understanding our personalities. And as I was telling you before we hit record, a lot of my focus is on introversion, extroversion, because I see some really misunderstandings and common misunderstandings. But we're on this show, we're interested in all the aspects of our personality, and I'm looking forward to getting into that.
Yeah, that's great because there are many different ways of slicing the pie and looking at it.
Yeah, for sure. And, you know, not all of us are alike. We share some common things that we can learn from, but we have to get to know ourselves too. And so how do you do that? How do you help people become more self-aware?
I think that you can, as many things, come at it from a lot of different angles. And I think one of the best authors or speakers I've heard on this is Tasha Eurich. She did a lot of research on self-awareness, and she talks about two different types, external and internal. So with internal self-awareness, it's really about using tools like, Myers-Briggs or Prism or DISC or other, values worksheets, things that help you reflect and explore who am I, what are my preferences, what do I like, what do I value? And then external self-awareness is more about, how do other people experience me? What's the energy that I bring into a room? How do they feel about themselves when I'm there? So I think, the twofold, helping people reflect using tools and then helping them get a little bit of feedback so they understand the impact they have on other people are kind of the two broad ways I think of in supporting people to develop self-awareness.
Yeah, it's definitely not enough just to understand yourself, but what's the impact that you're actually making, versus the impact that you want to make, and how do you do that?
100%. And I'm kind of continually amazed that the impact that people have is can be very far, spread from the impact they think they're having.
Right. So tell us about Sure People.
Yeah, so Sure People is, as I mentioned earlier, a tech startup, and we're kind of really on the vanguard integrating psychometric data, which is kind of I hate to use that word, it's jargony, but really kind of think about personality data, integrating it with artificial intelligence and technology. So, taking and really I think what we're pioneering is thinking about using these dimensions of personality as a legitimate data set that companies especially have at their fingertips to understand their people and to help people work better together and to think about placing their people. Whereas a lot of times, I think sometimes it's like, oh, I'm a red or I'm an owl or I'm a this, instead of kind of a hard data set that can be integrated with technology and used in really powerful ways.
Yeah, I'm a lion. A quiet lion.
I love that.
Yeah, I've
I'm a
I've
dove.
pro yeah, I've probably taken them all. So the software that you use, Prism, how is it different from other things? Like you brought up the disk, you brought up Myers-Briggs. I also like Clifton Strengths. How is it different from these instruments?
Yeah, it's a great question. And in a lot of ways, Prism, like I said, it measures 54 traits and attributes. It does integrate echoes of a model based on some of the Jungian work and some based on the work of William Marston, which is what the disc is founded on. There's conflict styles, motivation. So, in some ways, it definitely has echoes of some of these other models. But in other ways, I think one differentiator is that it's pretty comprehensive and that it brings them all together into one portrait. So I like to think that it's like if a bunch of cameras came around a person at a moment in time and got a snapshot. But then I think the biggest differentiator is just the integration of that data set with on a tech platform with AI where it takes the insights, for a lot of these assessments, people take them, you ask them about it, they're like, "Oh yeah, it's in my desk drawer," or my team's data is in a folder on my desktop. But where with Prism, we're kind of taking all that data and putting it in technology so that it gives you action. It tells you what to do with it. Okay, Lindsay, you're a warm-hearted people person, but you need to become, our science-backed algorithm tells you need to become more assertive and you need to learn to speak more directly and make sure you're following through on your execution. Oh, and by the way, you have a meeting later today with David, and remember, he's more internal and he's going to need more time to think about things. And oh, to be successful, you could send him some things ahead of time. So it really just takes that insight and moves it into action, both for yourself and for your relationships.
Yeah, it pegged David. David does need
Yeah.
time to think and process, and he does good work that way. So it's saying you need to be more assertive. Okay. I'm guessing that it's going to tell you to use differences to be assertive if it was telling me I needed to be more assertive. Does that make sense?
Say that
It,
again.
so is it coaching you differently with your personality to be more assertive? If it was saying I needed to be more assertive, would that look different for me or no?
It's a great question. They're all the different dimensions are attached to what we call prism practice areas. So it would probably take us both to the same prism practice areas. But then if you use the coach in the app and it looked at all of our different dimensions, it would probably give you different advice there than what it would give me based on because you might have aspects of your personality where you need to be more assertive, but then other points in your personality where actually kind of balance that. So it might be more of a balanced person in that way than myself. So there's a lot of kind of factors that go
Okay.
into it.
Yeah, no. Thank you. That's good. And how are companies or individuals using this?
So I think, there's a lot of different applications. The one I think is the most interesting and powerful is the application with teams. And I mean, we've all know what it's like to work in a team where people are miscommunicating or work for a leader that's got no emotional intelligence. What this data does is really, helps people onboard more quickly because they understand their entire team's makeup and then helps people communicate or like bring information and talk to each other in a way. And also, there's so much ambiguity in organizational life, and we constantly are making up stories. So, if I didn't know that you were internal and we were interacting, I might think like, oh man, David doesn't really care about what we're talking about.
Oh,
But then I could see, oh, I have access to your profile. Like I see, no, David's just internal. He's quietly processing everything, and I make up a totally different story than if I didn't have that kind of information. So I think,
yeah,
it keeps the lines
definitely. Yeah,
open.
it's like that's a real struggle, you know? And sometimes with me or other introverts, our emotions aren't our face isn't reflecting our feelings, it's a problem. And where I'm thinking, you might think, oh, he doesn't have anything to say, he doesn't care, but I'm doing my best work. I'm just processing internally before I share, whereas somebody else might need to talk out loud. Another way to put it is I'm not going to share a half-baked idea normally. But some people, that's how they work. They share a half-baked idea, and other people, and sometimes I engage like that. But for the most part, I'm going to think through my ideas and put them out there, well formed. Whereas somebody else, they need to, again, for lack of a better word, just release an idea that's not fully formed, but that's how they make it fully formed. It is the process of conversation. And if you don't understand that, there can be some conflicts for sure.
Exactly. And I love that you use that term. That's one we throw around a lot, the half-baked ideas. It's such a classic interaction of like somebody may come to you who's external and intuitive and spontaneous and say like, "Hey David, I've been thinking about this thing." And a classic kind of miscommunication is the you or somebody similar to your profile might be like, "Well, how's that going to work?" And tell me about this. Well, have you thought about this? And then I walk away feeling deflated and thinking like, "Well, I'm never sharing my idea again with David." And you walk away thinking like, why is she bringing me stuff that is not grounded in reality or that she hasn't really thought through?
Right, right. And there's so many things like this. I think that's a really good example of where if you don't understand it, you can definitely have some misunderstandings, but understanding it can make you powerful to work together and understand, you know, this is how this person works. That's how this other person works. And it goes in our relationships too. One of my favorite books on introversion is by Dr. Lori Helgo. And I had her on the podcast with her extroverted husband.
Oh,
And and that was the conversation. He was just like, I like to talk through things. And she's like, I like to think about things and then share. And he's like, that's not how it works. But, ultimately over they've been married 40 years. Ultimately, when he started editing her book, he's like, "Oh, I get it. I get it." But it was the same kind of back and forth. So it definitely happens in our workplaces. It happens in our relationships too.
100%. Yeah. I think you find a lot of extroverted, introverted couples out there. One wants to go out and socialize, and the other one is happy to let them carry the conversation.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So what's some ahas that you have seen with teams? Like, okay, beyond what we were just talking about, is there another example of something that this has really helped teams come together?
Yeah, I mean, it's what's interesting is like you think about an individual having a preference, but then you're like, what happens when 10 individuals get together who have that same preference and they're tasked with getting something done? And I think that's where it's so interesting to see like when you roll these things up to the team level, what are this team's collective strengths or blind spots and what are the patterns that they get stuck in? And as a team facilitator or, somebody that's in my previous life, I did more of, you can see these dimensions play out in a meeting. Somebody drops a piece of information or asks a question, and the big picture people go to the big picture. The detail people start looking in, to the fine weeds and the details. Or, another example I've seen is, you know, s- some people are more structured and really want to form a plan and keep a plan, and others are more open-ended and spontaneous. And when you have a team of spontaneous people, what can happen is a decision will get made, and then the next week the team's back together and it gets revisited. And then the next week it gets revisited again. And so the team can start to feel frustration around why are we not able to make a decision and stick with it? Why are we continually revisiting this? But then when you have the data, it's like, oh, it's a decoder. I see what's happening. It's that we're all spontaneous and we're staying open to information. How do we support ourselves to manage around that dynamic?
Yeah, so if you have only spontaneous people, you can have that issue.
Yeah.
And and on teams sometimes it's a lot of times it is kind of balanced. It just naturally works out that way. And somebody is gonna do more processing, and you just gotta balance that out. Like, okay, you can think about this, but at some point we have to make a decision. And the other way around.
Yeah, I do think sometimes people intuitively, sense these things and find each other to kind of pull together more balanced pairs or teams, but it's kind of like a shortcut.
Yeah. How do organizations and teams make this part of their culture? Like, how do they I mean, I'm sure it's an ongoing, continuous education because it's not something that is just intuitive to everybody.
Yeah, well, I think the great thing about what we're doing at Sure People is that everything lives on an app.
Okay.
So it's like your data, your team's data, everyone's data is like right there on your phone. And most of us are, for better, for worse, probably for worse, our phone's an extension of our hand. So, individuals, teams, organizations are able to integrate this into the way they think, into the way they speak, and able to use it in the flow of work. Like I'm going into a meeting, let me pull that up really quickly. So I think just kind of the ease of technology and tying it to this really makes it that much more scalable and able to kind of have that data at our fingertips to use it on a regular basis instead of having to like go back, find the document, try to figure out what that means for how I interact with another person. So it's, I think that's where when people start to think in terms of traits and attributes, you start to move as a team or an organization from a culture of kind of perception. Oh, Tim seems like a jerk, to traits and attributes. Oh, Tim's not a jerk. He's just a direct communicator who, is bold and decisive. So that's how I might experience him instead of kind of this perception that he's being too abrasive for my style.
Oh, I love that. I need to know more about this. This is awesome. So, what's the initial training look like before the app?
So, it's one of the things I like about Prism and the data set is that it's incredibly accessible. And one of the things we value is like democratizing this data. So it's something that anybody can take, if you took it right now, you'd get your report, you'd be able to read it and digest it. It would be pretty direct and straightforward. That being said, we do have like certification for people who are coaches, who are facilitators, who are, team process facilitators inside organizations where we go more into a deep dive and help them think about how it shows up or how to coach people using the data and the tools. But by and large, for the average person, they're able to get their report and put it into action with the app pretty quickly because the app's telling you basically what to do to interact with the person more effectively or to develop yourself. So it creates a lot of like, whoo, aha moments as people see themselves in the data and then are, helped guided as to how to bring it to life.
So, I hope this question makes sense. Like, how? how many people might you have access to? Is it your immediate team or the whole organization? I'm sure it just depends on the organization, but do you understand what I'm asking?
Yeah, absolutely. And it does. It goes down to kind of sometimes organizations will come and we'll get a team on board and then it starts to expand from there. Other times it's an entire organization that everybody has visibility. And sometimes there's different kind of confidentiality agreements, especially if some organizations tend to be a little bit more hesitant. So we'll keep the confidentiality around who can see who's a little bit tighter. So there is some variation there, but in an ideal world, we would, love for the whole organization to see the whole organization because I think you get the maximum value out of this when everybody's able to see the data and information of any other person they might be interacting with at the organization at any given time.
Does there ever come conflicts with how the data's interpreted from this app?
Oh, people are people, David. There's always
Yeah, of
conflict.
course, of course.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, because there's people who are naturally hesitant about their data and how it might be weaponized. There's people who are worried about AI, there's people who are worried about privacy. I mean, so you get a lot of having to navigate this and do it responsibly and do it safely as a company. But then there's also, this does not happen a lot, but people who get the report and have trouble seeing themselves. And in my experience, it boils down to three things, one of three things. One, often there are a certain type of personality. There are precise personalities who are like looking at every line and kind of thinking like, ooh, I don't know if that word actually represents, you know, me. Or they've been through a lot of change in the past few years, or they work in an environment that might be toxic or that forces them really to operate outside of their preferences. And so they're having a little confusion about who they are and how they're showing up.
Yeah, yeah, because I see that where, somebody takes an assessment and they're like, well, this isn't me or whatever, but you really have to look at it and see what it's telling you. And with anything, you still take it with a grain of salt, right?
Absolutely. And this comes from my coaching perspective. I always hold that the person is the expert on themselves. So let's take a look, let's dive in. Maybe there's a blind spot here or something, or an identity you haven't fully integrated into how you think about yourself. Or maybe it's just not the right read. But I'm never going to sit there as a coach or a person with an assessment and say, like, well, David, if you just look closely enough, this is who you are. I'm always going to let the person be the expert and kind of say what fits and what doesn't.
Yeah, I love that. You are the expert on yourself. And tools like this are tools. They give you some great information, but ultimately you're the one that self-reported the information, and you are the expert. It's some really good tools to help you get to know yourself, uncover some blind spots. But, ultimately it's a tool.
Exactly. And I think that's where we as practitioners and people who are advocating for this data or these tools have to be really careful. And and I know a lot of people use them very successfully for hiring, for selection, which is, I think it's often very predictive, but I also never want to see somebody be kept out of a position that they could be successful in because they didn't look like they could do the job. When in fact, like I believe absolutely in the growth and our ability to grow and develop as adults and as humans. And so my stance with this stuff is always kind of like, oh, let's take a look at your preferences based on your current context, which ones are serving you, and what might you need to develop to go get the things you want most in life.
Yeah. Let's talk about hiring. So how is it used in hiring? And, you know, I also know that there's many different personalities that can do the same job. They just might do it differently. So how is it used in hiring? Or how could it be used in hiring?
Yeah, so for our tool, it's not validated for hiring and selection, so we don't
Okay.
advocate for that
Okay.
at all. But I know for others, and I couldn't speak to this quite as in depth because ours isn't used this way.
Okay.
But I know there are, whole teams of IO psychologists that are out there validating the dimensions or the kind of preferences, the traits and attributes that have led to success in certain roles and finding people who fit those dimensions and using it for predictive success in hiring and selection. And I don't know, I don't have a firm stance on it, but it always kind of makes me a little like, ooh, that's how I feel about it.
Yeah, I kind of have the same reaction because, just talking about introversion, there's so many myths. Like introverts can't do this or can't do that. Well, no, they absolutely can. It's just good. It might look different, you know.
Exactly. And we were talking about this a little bit before we started recording, but there's not introverted activities or extroverted activities. There's about where you draw your energy and how you process information.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing if people said like, "Hey, let's have a podcast show, and this person's going to need to be interviewing people and public speaking and doing all these things," they would be like, "Oh, we need an extroverted person." When in fact, no, that's not at all the case, you know.
Yeah, and that's a really good example. And it's like I love this. I don't get nervous. When I was younger and I didn't understand introversion, yeah, speaking or doing something like this, which of course didn't exist, but would it have just really I would have been so afraid. But what I learned was, oh, I just got to prepare, you know? And I sent you questions ahead of time, whether you needed them or not, just so I could kind of have something to go off of. And if you needed them, great. And then afterward, I don't have anything planned for an hour in case I need to
Hmm.
recharge. I
Hmm.
might not. This conversation's not draining me. In fact,
I'm good. I'm glad.
it's energizing, you know. And that's the other myth I bust often is some conversations for introverts can be very energizing. But
Hmm.
we like the one-on-one. We like the small group. And for a podcast, I'm talking to you one-on-one, which I love.
It's
And
perfect.
but then many people can hear it. So yeah, so many misunderstandings. Uh,
Yeah. And just to kind of share also my own personal journey in relation to that, in our profile, I'm an amiable personality, which can often be people who don't like want the spotlight. And it can be hard to public speak or be in front of people. And one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life is to be seen at the front of the room.
okay.
And yet, it's something I've worked really hard at and I still don't love it, but I can do it. And I think this is where like it's so important for us as introverts or as amiables or as people who tend to be more quiet but observant to really push through and find our voice because often we have some of the most powerful insights or observations to share if we're willing to kind of take what feels like risk and put our voice out there.
Yeah. And I mean, we could talk about this for a whole episode, but definitely it's realizing, guess what? I do have something important to share. You know, another thing that's really helped me is, hey, I'm not perfect, but nobody is. Anybody listening to me is not perfect. So, yeah, those are all good things. Another application I think is probably pretty important is how does this how does this help people with their leadership?
Yeah, it's so important. And, it's again, it's like fascinating to me. Over the past 30, 40 years in the research around literature, all the research points to emotional intelligence as being the differentiator between good and great leaders. And emotional intelligence is, are you self-aware? Can you manage yourself? Are you socially aware? And can you navigate relationships skillfully? So, all this stuff does is provide you with self-awareness. And it's also interesting to me, one of the exercises we did in all of our leadership development courses was at the beginning kind of making the case for emotional intelligence and why this stuff is important in leadership. And we did this exercise where it was like worst boss, best boss. And you had the whole group talk about the worst boss, and then the whole group talked about the best boss. And, consistently the theme for best boss was never they're the smartest person in the room or they're a great strategic thinker. It was always about how they helped the person and how they facilitated getting great results out of that person or saw things in them that they didn't see in themselves. So I think when it comes to leadership, being able to be self-aware and understand your emotions and manage them and then to understand your impact and how to support other people and build strong relationships, it's incredibly critical especially once you move past being an individual contributor.
Yeah, so a leader with the app could check out their team members.
100%. And that is what I think is one of the most brilliant pieces of this. Because now, as a leader, I can understand my people, I can have a window into them. I don't need to call HR. Every time I have some sort of people issue, I can look and I can think, okay, I can see that my direct report is motivated this way, or I can see that they're an internal processor, or I can see that they're energized by doing this, or this is how they handle conflict. And I can use that data set to solve my own problems, to motivate my people, to navigate, to help move my lower performers up to high performance. by understanding what might be happening. So it's like you can use this data set to interpret what's going on and then to pull the dials that you need to get success out of the people that you're leading.
Yeah. Do you have any examples of a leader that's used this that had some good success?
Yeah, I'm trying to think about this exact context that we're talking about. I'm thinking more about relationships kind of going the opposite direction where people knew that their boss was a concrete processor and they were highly intuitive and so they went out and got information, prior to the meeting that made them more successful in those conversations. As far as leaders using it with their team, I think a classic example that I think of that we see a lot is, you know, on our dimension scale, some people are more attainment of goals and others are more recognition for efforts. So, a classic example is a high attainment of goals leader seeing like, oh, I have a total blind spot around giving my this person positive feedback or helping them, dial up their energy by acknowledging them and their effort and what they've done. Another example in oftentimes these bold, direct, decisive personality types, we call them powerful personalities in our model, will not realize that some other people on their team have more of the gentle, calm, warm qualities of some of the other types and that they need to say good morning and they need to allow a little more space and they need to show that they care because in fact they do care even though it doesn't feel like it or seem like it all the time. So I think those are some of the classic examples. Or the one we've talked about, like the extroverted leader who realizes they need to set their introverted team up for success by the way they design meetings or how they share information or the time they give in between meetings before a decision has been made. Those are some of the examples that are coming to mind.
Yeah. Yeah. Just in that example, provide an agenda, you know? You-
Exactly. It's not that hard.
what are we gonna talk about? Let people prepare. If it's a large meeting, think about that. Is everybody getting a chance to participate? You know, do you need to have some smaller meetings or even one-on-one meetings? You know, all of that. It's everybody getting a chance. You brought up like recognition, and that's a tricky one because as people, some people like to get recognized, and I think we all like to get recognized, but it looks different from person to person.
100%. Yeah, because for some people, like the worst nightmare is to be in the middle of a room and have somebody call them out and the whole crowd, like the group clapping. It's like, oh my word, please no. But to have that same person pulled aside and quietly told what they mean to the team and that everybody's seen, what they've done is it's a totally different story. So you're
Yeah.
absolutely
I saw somebody retire after many, many, many years at the company, and they didn't want to party. And to me, that was just crazy. It's like, yeah, if you've worked here for so many years, why don't you want to party? But just everybody's different.
yeah. When retirement's a big milestone for a lot of people, so it's hard to know sometimes what's going on
Yeah,
with people in that transition as well.
yeah. And then you've talked a bit about AI. Definitely want to get into that more. How does AI play into all that we're talking about?
Yeah, so let me just say, I am just like, my breath is taken away at the speed at which this is integrating into our lives. And so with AI on our app, it will take all of the psychometric information and pull on it to give you guidance or insight about yourself or the problem that you're struggling with. And so an example, we call it Sure Coach. I asked Sure Coach one time, I was working on a big project. It was taking me a really long time and I was getting frustrated that I wasn't making progress more quickly. And so I asked the app, like, what's going on with this? Why am I struggling? And it told me, like, oh, well, Lindsay, like, you have a flexible work style and you have an incredibly people-oriented personality. And so you might be kind of flexing your priorities as immediate needs of other people come up. And in fact, I was like, oh my word, like I felt so seen in that moment that it really knew and understood because it had all my information.
Yeah. And we want to feel seen. That's very interesting that you felt seen by the AI.
Yeah, it took my breath away for a moment because I was like, that's exactly what it is. And I think that's actually these data sets allow for these moments of seeing, whether you're using the AI or you're just, I've been with people. There's a woman I can think of who sat down and saw like she was like 80% feelings decider. And it was just like this moment of like, oh my word, yes, that is what's going on. Like I knew I kind of tended that way, but now I can see it brought into focus with this data. And so I think at its best, this kind of data allows us to see ourselves and to feel seen by others because they get us. I was going to say, I think it's one of the brilliance of introverts. I think often being some of the best listeners, observers, people who are so gifted at kind of listening and helping people feel seen and understood our world.
Yeah. And it's funny. I always say that introverts can be good listeners. Just because they're being quiet doesn't make them a good listener. So
That's
hopefully
true.
they are active listening. We are observers. A superpower of introverts is we reflect on things, and a lot of good comes from that. Just really sitting back and thinking about things and observing. And definitely we can be good listeners. Hopefully we are.
A better chance than extroverts, let's put it that way.
Yeah, 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 yeah. But just because somebody's talking doesn't mean listening's going on. Hopefully it is. But at the same time, if someone is doing a lot of the talking, hoping they're stopping to listen as well.
Yeah.
So we talked about team dynamics and leadership. Is there any other applications that we haven't talked about?
Team dynamics, leadership. The other thing I would love to see for some of this stuff, and this is part of what I'm trying to build out at Sure People, is kind of like personalized development at scale. So, how do you give somebody an app with like their information so they have all this awareness? And then how do you support them through experiences where they can develop what they need to develop to round themselves out? So, I think it really kind of helps people, individuals in organizations, own their own development in a way that can be difficult because depending on where you're sitting in an organization, sometimes there's not opportunities to develop until you get to the director level or, certain positions where there's money being invested. So here with this kind of data and technology, I feel like you can give an entry level employee or a lot of these deskless workers who are in retail or in these professions where they're moving quickly. They don't have time to like sit at a desk and pull out a bunch of data. They just have their phone to help them understand how they might be coming across, how they can maximize their potential, and then how they can develop. So one of the things I'm doing is designing a series of classes based on all of our Prism practice areas where people can have the algorithm tell them the skill they need to work on and then they can come into our academy at Sure People and attend in our class on, owning your power and authority or on deep listening or on project planning. So that's just kind of the last thing that came to mind when we talk about how to use this in a really powerful way at that individual level, which often you ask people in organizations, well, what do those people get at the entry level? And they say nothing. They don't get anything because we don't have the money to scale at that level.
Oh, I love that. I love that because that's what this show is all about, is really all of these things, personal growth, how to function well in teams and leadership and all of that. So with the AI, is the information being constantly updated since AI is changing so rapidly?
Everything is kind of constantly in flux because of technology and AI changing so rapidly. But with our tool, it's almost like with ChatGPT, it goes out into the internet and pulls
Yeah,
all this
right.
information. Where if you think about Sure Coach on our app, it's more of like a closed container that holds just your psychometric information.
Gotcha.
So yeah, when it goes to pull, it's just being pulled from your data set. So in that case, it's more static.
Okay.
But
Yeah,
how
what's
we integrate other things, I think, is changing really quickly. So it, could be very different in 6 months than what we're talking about now.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So, Lindsay, I could talk with you all day. This has been a wonderful conversation. Is there anything else that we didn't talk about that you would like to?
I'm sure I'll think of it later tonight.
Yeah, of course.
Because I am 50% introvert.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
um, yeah,
absolutely.
this is such a fun conversation, David, and I had a great time and just so many things here to talk about and explore, and I really appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, of course. Where can people find out more about you and the work that you're doing?
My LinkedIn is always on that, probably more than I should be. And then, Sure People is our company website, surepeople.com, and also on LinkedIn. The company's on LinkedIn. So those are our the best bets.
Very cool. All right, thanks again.
Yeah. Thank you, David.
Thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate you. I hope you take the time to explore other episodes and learn from other amazing guests. Remember, If you're interested in getting to know yourself better, there is now a free Type Finder personality assessment on the Quiet and Strong website. This free assessment will give you a brief report, including the four-letter Myers-Briggs code. I'll add a link in the show notes. And I'd love to connect with you. Reach out at david@quietandstrong.com or check out the quietandstrong.com website, which includes blog posts and links to social media for Quiet and Strong and much more. Send me topics or guests you would like to see on the show. So many great things about being an introvert, and so we need those to be understood. Get to know your introverted strengths and needs and be strong.